And now the next speaker is going to be James Bean, Standard Club. James is the Managing Director of Standard Europe, recently appointed, congratulations. And basically on the same note, but from a different angles, we're still going to be discussing of claims. James is going to address us or try to clarify to us, because by the way, renewal times is coming in, and so there will be many of these discussions with the ship owners and so on. So what's the effect of claims and on your record and so on. Chris has given us an idea of quickly what abatement is, how you deal with big claims and so on. James is going to tell us about actually how does claims inflation is taken into account when working out premiums which are considered enough to cover the risk. James.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Federico, for the kind introduction, and of course, thank you to Francesco for the opportunity to speak here today. To quote a Singaporean lawyer I heard speak a few months back, I will adopt the miniskirt approach to my presentation, short enough to keep you interested, but hopefully long enough to cover my modesty. How does claims inflation affect premium? Well, Mr. Diodato could probably reduce this presentation to about 10 seconds and tell you, have a decent broker, it won't. Setting that aside, I will actually now explore a little bit more how claims inflation does affect premium. And in order to do so, I think it's important to define what we mean by ordinary inflation before we then go on to consider claims inflation, what it is, why it's important, and how it comes on to affect premium. We'll then touch on mitigation. I'm conscious that in talking about claims inflation, we have a room full of ship owners and operators. If we talk about that impact it has on premium, there's no way I'll make it out the door for my 5 o'clock flight if I simply say it's just going to affect premium, that's all. There are, of course, things that the international groups clubs can do to mitigate inflation, and Christopher Brown has just touched on some of those points. So what is ordinary inflation? Sustained increase in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. It's measured using a monitoring of prices for an average basket of goods and services over time. So in its simplest terms, it compares the price of goods this month as it would against the price of goods last month. But what is claims inflation? As Christopher mentioned, clubs now spend a good deal of money in employing actuaries who are there to evaluate the risks and exposures the club faces and to quantify that. We heard earlier that to predict the future, you have to invent the future, and some might say, well, to predict the future, you have to invent the figures. I'm assured by the actuaries at the Standard Club that that is not the case. There are people far cleverer than I that consider this question and will come up with a figure. For claims inflations, the figures that I've heard quoted range between 1% and 5%, depending upon very much the market that you're operating in. But in order to consider claims inflation, I think it's important to consider the context in which claims inflation arises. Of course, as an insurer, we promise to indemnify our insureds following a loss caused by an insured peril subject to the limits for an upfront premium. So essentially, in essence, what we're saying, and the product that we sell, is the future payment of claims. In a liability scenario, the future payment of claims can be anything from 1 to 5 to 10, in some courts 20 years away. So when an insurer charges his premium, he needs to take that into consideration. How is inflation measured? Well, I'm assured, it's not my maths, apparently you take the increase in number, you then take the increase in value, you times the two, and that gives you a percentage. But there's two key ingredients there which I'm going to focus on: frequency and severity. There's no question that in the last few years we've seen a reduction in the number of claims. And why is that? Largely it's due, we heard earlier in talks about China, India reducing the amount of commodities that they purchase. So we're seeing a reduction in world trade, which in turn is seeing a reduction in the number of incidents. We're seeing owners, notwithstanding the market pressures, still continuing to spend huge amounts of money on loss prevention, training and having the right crew. There's also technology. Now, that's a whole different subject as to whether that reduces claims or increases claims. We don't have time to consider, but it's safe to say, with technology should come safer shipping and reduced number of claims. We also, of course, see older ladies leaving the market. Whilst we see that claims frequency drops off, there is one thing that we do see, and that is that the claims environment generally continues to be hostile to ship owners. Why is that the case? In the UK, you only have to turn on the TV for an advert to appear saying, have you had an accident or injury at work? And there's no question that the compensation culture that we see in the US has spread to the UK, it's spread throughout Europe, and more recently we're seeing it even in India and the Philippines with an increased level of aggressiveness towards the ship owner in terms of the claims that are being brought. We also see the intervention of the authorities. I think the Costa Concordia is a good case in point. It's a $1.4 billion wreck removal operation. There's no hesitation in my mind that it could have been done for less. A decision was made, whether rightly or wrongly, that rather than cut it up into pieces, it should be par-buckled, which led to considerable additional cost. Likewise, it could have been taken by a heavy lift vessel to Turkey and disposed of there. But the view again, and it's not my role to question the judgment, was an Italian solution for an Italian problem. The decision was made to tow it round to Genoa to be scrapped. However, all of that adds to costs, and that adds to the severity, which in turn drives up claims inflation. I think Donald Rumsfeld might have actually had a hand in the Marine Insurance Act, from what I can see from Andrew's slides, which is there are known knowns. I think claims inflation is a known unknown. That said, whilst we can't accurately predict the future, the one thing that we can say is that in the current environment, inflation and claims inflation, i.e. the cost of claims in the future, is likely only to head one way, and that's north. So why is claims inflation important? I think it's an important metric for pricing long-tail liabilities. It's also a very influential factor for insurance clubs when it comes to reserving, planning, and setting their capital requirements. If clubs do not take into consideration claims inflation, they won't be here tomorrow. And I think the quote from the actuary, my favourite read on the weekend, is probably quite appropriate. Claims inflation constitutes a threat to both the profitability and security of insurers worldwide. Now, I may hear you say, well, you're a mutual, profitability doesn't come into it, and you're right. That said, our main goal is in achieving an underwriting balance, and that is essentially ensuring that the costs, the money coming in through premium and investment returns matches the money going out the door in settling and paying for claims. It's with that in mind, when clubs come to approach their renewal, and as a quirk of nature, we do that every 20th of February, the idea of claims inflation is that it's addressed principally through the general increase to take into account the future levels of claims that a club might face. There are, of course, other factors, but I just put that out there as the proposition. Now, as I mentioned, there's no way I'd make it to the door if I didn't address what the clubs can do to address mitigation, to address claims inflation. And I think it goes quite appropriately back to the point that Mr. D'Amato made before the lunchtime session, and which was really what are the clubs doing to cater and control the tonnage that's in the market and the risks that we write. Now, whilst we can't insist that older tonnage leaves the market or due to the market nature of insurance prevent older ships from being insured, clubs do have the opportunity to only write the good risks, not to chase the premium, to focus on risk management and to look at how owners and operators trade, and by taking that into consideration and through working alongside our legal colleagues is when claims do arise, getting onto them quickly, assessing the exposures to the club and looking to mitigate and draw a line under them properly. From a group perspective, that's what clubs can do individually. From a group position, we of course engage with the authorities when it comes to dealing with the regulatory environment and also working with them when it comes to major casualties. And there's a very interesting international group initiative which involves engaging and reaching out to authorities and convincing them that the international group clubs have the wherewithal and know-it-all to handle appropriately a major casualty. And by doing so and giving that confidence, we can hopefully look to mitigate the costs of the future. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll pass you over.